once you get an audit letter, that's when you really have to start being careful, because people often do the wrong thing. Sometimes do one of two things that could be wrong, okay? One thing that could be wrong is people overcomply. People just say, okay, oh man, the government's asking questions. Let me give them every single thing that I have, no matter what, okay? It's one thing to give them what they're asking for. It's another thing to give them more than they're asking for. And the general rule is certainly never give them more than they're asking for, because I guarantee the more you give them, the more information and ammunition they will have to keep looking. And I can't tell you how many situations I've seen where taxpayers innocently give information and then it just leads to more and more audits.
You have followed the rules, and then a brown envelope arrives. In that moment, you realize the CRA doesn't just want a seat at your table. They just happen to want the whole table. And today we're talking to this man, a man who fights back when the state tries to claim your sovereignty. He is a tax litigator in Montreal. His passion is to fight against the CRA, fight for the rights of business owners, fight for the rights of families that the only crime that they have committed is to make some money in Canada. Today we have a very special guest. Here with us is our friend Dov Whitman. Dov, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Dov, when it comes to the tax litigation and the work that you do, what moved you initially to do this? What was the thing that prompted you to take this career path?
I mean, I guess there was a couple of different elements to it. At first, it was really just the idea of tax was something that was very interesting to me. It was super, super complicated, super technical, but also very philosophical and very policy driven. Tax actually affects every single part of our life. Almost everything we do in our life has some potential tax implication. So that means tax cases that for me become very interesting because a lot of times they're about the way people live their lives and the choices that people make. It's about the industries that they're in, the jobs that they choose. So there's a lot of very human elements to the practice of tax, just that I find interesting. And then in terms of the litigation, I always like the good fight. And this is a really great thing to fight about. For me, like fighting the government is something you can feel good about, never worried that, you're the big guy trying to bully the little guy, because compared to the government, you're always the little guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No matter how much money you have, no matter how big you are, you're always the little guy. The government always has more money and more resources. So you're always, in a sense, kind of the underdog. And I like that, I like fighting for the underdog. What makes me frustrated is the government overreach, because, there's really two separate questions when it comes to tax, right? There are kind of policy questions about what should the law be and what shouldn't the law be. And those are important questions, that's for sure. But that's not really where I spend most of my time. I let other people deal with what should the laws be. For me, it's, okay, these are the laws, these are the rules that you, the government, have instituted, but now you got to follow them. You can't make laws and make rules and then not follow your own rules. Like, to me, it's a big problem that I have. And that's kind of what motivates me a lot in tax litigation is, you want to make these crazy rules. Okay, like we'll play by the rules. But then when we play by the rules that you yourself made, don't come and start changing and moving the goalposts and saying, well, really the rules are different. Well, no, you made the rules, so now you got to live by them. That's kind of what we aim to do.
Dov, is that something you see often, then, that they don't follow their own rules? Is that like the main reason why you have a job?
Well, absolutely. Like, that's what they do all the time. Now, sometimes it's questions of interpretation, and then sometimes it's questions of judgment, but very often the government will challenge the things that taxpayers do. There's no basis for it. There's no basis for it. There's no support for it. There's no foundation, and they just, they don't like it. And then because they don't like it, they find a reason to challenge it. But I don't really think that's the way government should be working. Government has a role to play, of course, and there's an oversight role, but it should be okay. Let's look at what you did, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. But We shouldn't just say we don't like the result and now find a way to justify, then what? It's just a cash grab. I mean, that's not the role of government and that's not the role of tax, you know? So that's something that we try to
Well,
push back on.
Dov, I find that interesting. We've had the tax code for a very long time, and there's still different ways to interpret the tax code and move the goalposts. How is this even possible after hundreds of years of the tax code? This is shocking to me.
But what's interesting? It's like if you compare, for example, the Income Tax Act in Canada to the Internal Revenue Code in the US, okay? So the the tax code in the US is much, much, much more detailed. Very, very detailed, okay? Which is why in the US, there's a lot less room for tax litigation because everything is spelled out black and white, okay? But in Canada, the way the act is written, yes, it's very complicated, but it's nowhere near as detailed as the US counterpart. So many questions are often questions of they're judgment questions of how should we apply the law to these facts, because it's not always clear and always need to get resolved by the courts. And courts say different things at different times. And you can have one fact situation, you get one answer, you have another fact situation, you get another answer, which is why sometimes you end up with seemingly similar situations, but with different results and different rules. And that's one of the reasons why tax litigation becomes so important in Canada, because the code is not as you might find in other jurisdictions.
That's interesting. And why would you say this difference exists? Like, we're like both countries under the system of common law, but why would it be so different? Like, why do they have more clarity than our system? Why would you think that happens?
So, first of all, I don't know. But if I had to guess, I would just say it's because they're bigger. The US is bigger, 5, 6 times the size. So it made more sense or makes more sense to have like these issues come up probably way more often than they do in Canada. So maybe that's why their system just evolved faster. But that would only be speculation. Like I couldn't say.
Okay.
I couldn't say.
Dov, do you have some examples? Earlier, you mentioned government overreach, and that's something that we talk a lot about, and how the government wants to put their hands into everything, especially when it comes to finances and, of course, taxation. One of the main means of revenue generation for the government is it's either
Yeah.
taxation or inflation. They can't produce anything. Everything they have has to be either confiscated or just created out of thin air. What are some of those examples of overreach? When you think about government overreach and what you fight through, what are some of the top examples that come to mind?
Well, there's a lot, that's for sure. There's a lot. Let me think of a couple different kinds of examples. I mean, one thing that we see a lot, and especially like I specifically deal a lot with, transactions that get considered to be aggressive tax planning. That's what the CRA calls them. And what you'll find is that when you have these kind of situations, the CRA is often not really clear on why they don't like it. And usually what they'll do is they'll throw out a whole bunch of reasons. They'll say, we don't like it because of this. And if it's not this, it's this. And if it's not this, it's that. And then if all else fails, then we think it's abusive tax planning, you know? So they like to throw out a lot of different things at you. And people get scared because they say, wow, they said I did this wrong and I did that wrong and I did that wrong. But a lot of it, in my opinion, is first of all an intimidation tactic. They want people to be scared. They want people to open up a 30-page letter and say, "Oh my God, the government has 30 pages to say why I'm a crook, so they must be right." That's number one. But number two, to me, it also shows that they're not really 100% sure about what's wrong with it. Like if it was clear that it was wrong, and if there was a clear violation, they would just say it doesn't work because of this. But they don't have those kinds of arguments. So what they have to do is they have to come up with alternative arguments, and they just say, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's that. And the way I feel about it is if you're not really sure, then leave everybody alone. Why are you making all this trouble if you're not really sure what the problem is?
Exactly. And what do you
Right.
think will be their motivation? Because they're not even sure.
Yeah,
It,
that's
right.
my question.
If you're not sure what's wrong, then what are the motivations? Is that like they have bonuses, like quotas that they have to fill? Like, tell me about it.
Well, I mean, the motivation is very simple. It's just, the Department of Finance says we need more money. So they tell them get as much money as you can. And I mean, look, it's like obviously it becomes political at a certain point because the more that the government raises the budget, then the more taxes they have to raise in order to cover the budget. And, as you said, tax is pretty much their source of revenue. So they just say we need more money. And that's one of the issues, which is that a lot of this stuff is not being driven by policy concerns. It's just being driven by we need more money. Okay, but like, why is that everyone's problem? You know,
When they say, yeah, we need more money, how does that directive comes from top to down to the actual auditor that's going to audit someone? Do they have, like in the sales world, quotas and goals? Do they have something like that?
that's always a big question. Nobody seems to really know exactly. I mean, the CRA always says that they don't, but we understand that they have some kind of incentives.
Hmm.
So it's not really clear exactly what kind of quota, but we understand that there is some kind of incentive. What exactly it looks like, I couldn't tell you. We understand there's some kind of incentive.
Okay. But these are not public domain.
No, nobody
Or
really.
they should be, right? Like they're like a public servant. So it wouldn't.
You would think.
Well, this is what's crazy. So this takes me to I'm here from the government. I'm here to help. I mean, it shouldn't their purpose be to help Canadians and
Yeah,
as opposed to the opposite?
yeah.
So what can business owners, how can they protect themselves? Do you have any ideas around how can we stay sovereign and avoid CRA coming after us?
There's always two things to consider, right? There's the bigger policy questions, which is an important question of if people feel that, their voices are not being heard in Parliament and the policies that they want to see being enforced are not being enforced. But again, that's not really my area. It's certainly not my area of expertise, and it's not really anything that I'm involved in. So I can't comment on that. All I can really comment on is, okay, we're in this system, you know, how can you protect yourself best? How can you ensure that your experience in the system is as smooth as possible? Right? So the question really becomes when you come across some kind of interaction with the government, when does it make more sense to accede to what they want and when does it make sense to fight it? Because sometimes it's not worth the fight, but sometimes it is. And it's knowing that difference that really makes all the distinction, really makes all the difference, right? Like sometimes you might think, okay, look, I really don't like what they're doing and it's a big principled argument. Okay, I suppose. And you wouldn't be wrong to fight it, but maybe your life will just be easier if you don't, right? But then again, you have to know, okay, but by giving them what they want, am I opening myself up to more? Is it really just one thing, or is it going to become one thing and then another and then another and then another? This actually comes back to the question that you asked before about what do you do when the brown envelope comes, okay? Because that's usually the starting point for everything. So let's dig into that a bit,
Of
okay?
course. Yeah.
So often the starting point for these interactions is you get a letter from the government saying we're going to audit you, okay? And the trigger for the audit could be anything. They don't usually tell you what has triggered the audit. They have audits that they do by industry. They have audits that they do when people have a certain net worth. They have audits that they do if there's something that looks funny in your tax return. Like there can be many, many different things that trigger an audit. But once you get an audit letter, that's when you really have to start being careful because people often do the wrong thing. And sometimes do one of two things that could be wrong, okay? One thing that could be wrong is people overcomply. People just say, okay, oh man, the government's asking questions. Let me give them every single thing that I have, no matter what, okay? It's one thing to give them what they're asking for. It's another thing to give them more than they're asking for. And the general rule is certainly never give them more than they're asking for, because I guarantee the more you give them, the more information and ammunition they will have to keep looking. And I can't tell you how many situations I've seen where taxpayers innocently give information and then it just leads to more and more audits. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that you should just refuse it, because you cannot. That's a criminal offense. But the question is not, do you respond or do you ignore it? That's not the question. The question is, how do you respond? And it's all about how you respond. Okay. So one thing is obviously not over responding. Okay. The other thing is also not under responding, because a lot of people, their instinct is, oh, I got a letter from the government. Who are these people? I don't know them anything. They have no right to ask me questions, and just go fly a kite. Okay. I suppose a person could do that if they want, but the thing to remember is, first of all, that's a criminal offense. So a person who does that exposes themselves to the potential of criminal prosecution. It's not common, but that potential exists. That's number one. And number two is, I guarantee you, writing some kind of letter like that back to them is not going to stop them. It may feel good. It may feel nice to be able to get that off your chest and to vent, but it's not going to achieve the outcome you want. If the outcome you want is for the government to back down, that's not going to do it. If anything, that'll make the government come after you more. They're going to say, oh, this guy, he probably has something to hide. So, the question always becomes knowing what to give and what not to give, and where to draw the line and when to fight, right? And that's why it is definitely helpful to consult a professional from the beginning. And I can't tell you how many situations I've seen where people come to me down the road after they've already started to have a lot of correspondence back and forth. And here's what often happens. In the beginning, people think, oh, I'll handle it on my own. But then they either give too much, or they just write letters saying, you guys are terrible, and they've just made a mess of it. And what ends up happening, inevitably, is just that it becomes a much more expensive proposition. It's as simple as that. So if you get someone like me involved in the beginning, it will likely end up costing you much less than if you wait to get me involved. That's really the long and short of it.
Exactly. So basically, as soon as you see that brown envelope arriving right here, essentially.
Exactly. Because you also need to know, there are some audits that are just routine audits, that they just want a couple things and you give them what they want and they're going to go away. Okay. Those are not worth fighting, because you just give them what they want and they're going to go away. It's simple.
But it's still nice to call you to ask you, hey, this is the request. What should we do? Right?
Yeah. Well, but that's the point, right? Like, you need to be able to know the difference. Yeah. You need to be able, so I can look at something and say, look, this looks like a routine audit, just give it, and then they're going to go away and you're never going to hear from them again. Yeah. Or I could say, hey, the kind of stuff they're asking for is a little out of the ordinary. It seems a little strange. I think they have some bigger picture that they're going after here. We better be careful.
And that opinion is worth gold. Like, it's worth paying for. Otherwise, you're going to pay with time, with stress, and with even more money, which doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love that. Dov, you mentioned when you receive the audit letter that be careful not to be like overreact, and also not to go in the side of overcompliance. Could you give us like a brief example, like a real story? And we don't have to mention real names, but like a real example of overcompliance.
Overcompliance? Sure. Sometimes people try and start giving explanations. Okay. So sometimes, a very typical initial audit letter will be saying, send us your minute book, send us your resolution, send us your contracts, your receipts. Like, that's a very routine, typical audit. Okay. They may ask for a couple of documents about a specific transaction. But sometimes what people will do is they think, oh man, the CRA is asking me questions about this transaction. I better start and give them, I better go on the defensive right away. And I better tell them, well, oh, this transaction, we did this and we did that, and it's because of this and it's because of that. But I always say, don't answer a question you haven't been asked. If they didn't ask you, don't start giving explanation, because I've seen more than once this kind of thing where, the CRA was just asking routine questions, and then the taxpayer, obviously before getting me involved, decided, oh, you know what? I'm going to tell them everything. I'm going to give them all the explanations, and then they're going to see that I'm in good faith. They're going to see I'm cooperating, and then they're going to leave me alone. No. You give them all these explanations, they're going to catch on the one thing that you write that they don't agree with. They're going to say, we want to know more about that. So being extra cooperative doesn't help. No, being difficult doesn't help either, but being over cooperative, it doesn't really help.
100%. Yeah, George.
So it sounds to me like the key is knowing the difference, as you mentioned. So when you get this letter, what should be their first step? Or what's the first 2 or 3 things that they should do once they receive a letter?
The first thing that a person should do is they should contact a professional. Now, you don't necessarily need to contact a tax lawyer right away. You can start, because not everyone has a tax lawyer and not everyone, knows how to do that, but most people do have an accountant. So you should definitely, at a minimum, contact your accountant. The thing that people need to remember is that accountants sometimes have a different way of looking at the world, and an accountant often, and again, I'm not trying to generalize for all accountants, but, some people may have a mindset of, oh, the CRA is asking, let's just give it, right? So, contacting an accountant could be good, but for sure the best way is to contact the tax lawyer. That's for sure the best way. It's not necessarily the cheapest way, but it is definitely the best way. And I think a person needs to know. I think a person needs to have a general sense of their tax affairs to know, okay, have I done anything that I think might trigger the government scrutiny, or really have I done nothing whatsoever, right? And there's nothing about your business or your employment that's unusual or out of the ordinary. Okay, then maybe it's just a routine and you answer a couple questions and go away. But the second that you know that you've done a couple things, not that are wrong, of course not, but just things that are maybe not typical, then you might say to yourself, hey, I think the government might not understand, might try and come after me, might whatever. Then you really want to get a tax lawyer involved, I would say, because you need to protect yourself.
Something that our audience understands is the concept of opportunity cost. And when you mentioned, yes, contacting a tax lawyer might not be the cheapest, when you factor in the actual opportunity cost of not contacting the lawyer and the added time that you're going to have to put in to deal with this, and the sleepless nights and everything that happens, just because you don't have a professional dealing with that, I think a lot of listeners will agree that it might actually be the cheapest option to contact the tax lawyer. Yeah. So I want to go back to when you mentioned aggressive tax planning. I think about, okay, I don't even want to get into the position where I get that letter. How do we avoid, or how do we increase our chances of not ever getting that letter, Dov?
How do you increase your chances of not getting the letter? Well, so like I said, there are different ways that audits get triggered, right? So there are some things that you can do that will minimize that, and there are some things that you can't really do. So for example, the easiest thing that triggers audits is when you have compliance issues, people who don't file their returns on time, people who have missing returns, stuff like that. That's the easy one. If the CRA sees, oh, this guy hasn't filed returns in 5 years, or his corporation hasn't filed returns, or if you filed them late, or if you make mistakes and you have to file amendments, those are all things which will trigger reviews. And then even if you're 100% right, like you've done nothing wrong, okay? But trigger a review, and then you're talking months and months and months of back and forth and time and like all of that, which could have been easily avoided from the beginning. So, like that's something that is very easy for people to do. That's number one. Number two is if you think that there are, let's say transactions or things you can do that without reporting them, that's another thing. So, for example, one thing the government does often is they have access to the provincial or municipal land transfer indexes. Okay. So they can see all of the transactions, all of the sales of property, of real estate, all the purchases, everything. So if you buy or sell a house, even if you don't put it in your tax return, the government will know. Okay. I've had many situations where audits were started not because of what was reported, but because of what was indicated in the land transfer registries. And then if you have a sale or a transaction which is reported in a registry but is not in your return, that I guarantee you is going to cause an audit because that's going to look, hey, there's something that's, something that's funny. So those are things that you can do to minimize your chances of getting audited. If you do something though, which the government will consider aggressive tax planning, then there's a very high chance that no matter what you do, you'll end up getting audited regardless. Because a lot of times what happens is, let's say someone sells you a plan, okay? But the person that sells you the plan probably sold it to 100 other people or 1,000 other people, right?
Which plan you're
So
talking
even
about here, Dov? Which type of plan?
like some kind of tax plan, okay?
Okay.
Some kind of product, like something which is legitimate, but some kind of financial product or some kind of tax plan or tax shelter or whatever you want to call it, okay? Something which is completely legal, right? But these things can happen, right? So then even if you don't get audited, but if that person gets audited, the government will often ask them to give the names of all of their customers and their entire client base, and they will have to give it, and they most likely will. So you personally can end up being audited as a result of a third party audit.
Oh.
So, very often just by doing business with anybody, or even if it's not tax related, like there was a very famous case several years ago where eBay got audited. Okay, eBay was audited, and the government wanted the list of everyone that was considered a power seller on eBay. Okay, they asked eBay for that because the government thought that these people were selling stuff on eBay and they weren't declaring their income. And eBay didn't want to give it, but in the end, the court forced them to give it. So the point is that the government can get information about you from other people that you do business with. And those kinds of things, it's somewhat unavoidable because then you have no say in it. You have no say on whether eBay gives it or doesn't give it. You can't tell them not to. If they give it, they give it. And to the extent that any person does business with other people, they can get it. The government has a lot of power. The government can go to your bank. Like, you think that when the government calls you and says, we want your bank statements, you think if you say no, that's going to stop them? The government can go directly to your bank and ask the bank for your bank statements. And they don't even have to tell you, and the bank doesn't have to tell you. So the government right now at this moment could be looking through your bank statements and you will have no clue whatsoever.
And, there's no need for a court order or anything. It's just like, hey, we need this.
Yeah, they don't need a court order. They just issue it. Now, there are ways to fight it, but you think the bank is going to fight it? Probably not. The bank doesn't want trouble with the government. So,
wow, that's a little scary.
of course it's scary. Of course it's scary. Like all of your information, all but a very large amount of your information is potentially within the reach of the government.
Wow. What are your thoughts on the concept or the idea of guilty until proven innocent? Is this the approach that they take often, or what are your thoughts around that?
It's a very good question. In a sense, yes, that is kind of the approach that is taken. And there is a policy justification for that. I'm not saying I agree with it, but there is a justification for that, right? And the policy reason for that is what they'll say is, look, we're the government. We don't really know what you guys have been up to. Only you know, right? So if you are the ones that know, then you are the ones that have to prove to us that what you've done is right. And okay, maybe there's a logic to that, but the trouble becomes two things. Number one, the trouble becomes when that power gets abused to just become witch hunts and just to say, okay, well, we're just going to accuse everybody, and then now it's your job to prove to us that you're correct, which becomes very difficult. Number two, one thing that we're seeing more and more often is the government will ask you questions about things that have happened years ago. And it's not uncommon anymore to get audit letters, and the government will say, oh, you did something 10 years ago. We want more details about it. And you say, okay, 10 years ago, I don't have any of that stuff anymore. I don't have those records anymore. I'm not even required to keep my records that long. So now you don't have any more records. You don't have any more documents. You can't prove anything. And the government says, well, if you can't prove it to us, then we're going to tax you. And then you're really in trouble, because the way the system works as it is that, yes, you are guilty until proven innocent. And if you can't prove your innocence, you're going to have a very hard time.
Wouldn't that be something that will be easily dismissible in a court? 10 years, but I'm not even required to keep the documents. Isn't that like an easy win for you, Dov?
No, unfortunately not, because under the laws as they are right now, the government is completely entitled to do that. They're completely entitled to do it.
Okay, so what? But you don't have the records and you're not even required. So what would be the exit there?
Well, in a case where you don't have the records, your only recourse will be to go to court and to try and testify. Because here's the thing that people have to remember also. So there's a very big difference between what happens when you're dealing with the government versus when you're dealing with the courts. Okay. When you're dealing with the government, when you're dealing with CRA, they want everything in paper. Okay. If there isn't a paper, then according to the government, it doesn't exist. Okay. You can tell them, yeah, I did this and I did that. If you don't have some kind of paper that proves it, the government will say, we don't believe you. So that makes it very difficult when you're dealing with the government, especially when you're dealing with things that may have happened a long time ago. Not everyone keeps a note of every single thing that they ever do in their entire life, but that's kind of how the government expects you to operate. But if you go to court, a court will accept a much broader category of evidence, and the court will accept your evidence saying, look, this is what I did, and here's what I was thinking, and here was the reason. I don't have any papers to show it, but that will be enough for a court. So going to court is always the option when you have no records anymore. But if a person wants to minimize that, then keeping your records can be better. Right? So that's where it becomes a very difficult question, because a lot of people say, okay, should I keep my records or should I not keep my records, right? So on the one hand, let's say there's a certain amount of time that you're required to keep records, and afterwards, if you don't keep them, and then the government asks you for them, then you can say, I don't have them, and that's fine. But the problem with that is that when you tell the government, I don't have any records anymore, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of it. The government will say, okay, you don't have documents, we're just going to start making assumptions about what we think happened. And now the government's going to say, okay, we're going to make assumptions about what we think happened. You have to prove to us that it didn't happen. And now you're in trouble, because now how are you going to prove it to them? Because now you don't have any documents, you don't have any records, right? So I usually tell people, keep your documents forever. Just keep them forever. Because if you ever need them, you're going to have a much easier time with them than without them. If you find yourself in a situation where you don't have documents, then what you want to do is stop dealing with the CRA and try and go to court, because the CRA will never agree with you if you don't have documents. A court might agree with you. A court might say, look, yeah, you look believable, and I can understand why it's 20 years later you don't have documents. But I've literally seen that, things that happen where the government says, we want documents from 20 years ago. 20 years. Who has that? Nobody has that.
Well, I'm so glad you're here talking to us because I don't think anyone would expect that. To think, oh yeah, they're gonna ask for those documents 20 years ago. It's insane.
It really is.
Tell me something, Dov, about who's the real target now in 2026? Is that you know middle class families? Are those like gig workers, small business owners? Who has their crosshairs on now in 2026?
Honestly, everyone. That's the truth. But there's a couple different things, right? Like we've known for a long time that they certainly go after people with high net worth. That's for sure. They have the whole audit division designated just for people with high net worth. So that's one thing. For sure,
They have
people
an
that,
they have an audit division specialized in people with high net worth.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So if you make too much money,
You have VIP
you're on
treatment.
the audit. Yeah, VIP treatment, you're on the audit. Another thing is people that are self employed, there's a lot of questions about deductions, about receipts, about expenses. There's a very high chance that someone that's self-employed is going to get audited, um, especially if your income is not consistent. If it changes a lot from year to year, goes up and goes down, like they're going to ask questions. When you're a salaried employee, your risk of being audited is much less because they feel your income is just what's in your T4 and that's it. Um, People, small businesses, and anything bigger than that.
Well, I think certainly part of the problem, as you said earlier, are running crazy deficits. They're printing money like there's no tomorrow.
Yeah,
And they need revenue. Where do they get their revenue? Their revenue comes from us,
of course.
right? The hardworking Canadians.
Yeah.
So this is certainly troubling. Just the whole idea of overstep, doing what they want. You got to prove that you're innocent. It's all very, very troubling.
No, it's absolutely very troubling and it's very disconcerting. And I think that the one message that people need to know is that it is possible to fight back. Because I think a lot of people don't realize that. And a lot of people think, oh man, the government wants this, the government wants that. If it's the government, they must be right. You know, the government, they must be right. They must know what they're doing. They must be allowed to do what they're doing. So I just better give them what they want without even a second thought. And the message is no, that's not true. You can always fight back. A lot of times the government asks for things they're not entitled to. A lot of times the government says you owe tax that you don't really owe. So you can fight back. Now, you have to know when to fight back and you have to know how to fight back. But it's important to know that you can fight back. It's not just, okay, the government gets to do whatever they want. No, the citizens can also take matters into their own hands and can bring the fight to the government.
Yeah,
That's for sure.
and for you there listening, you don't have to figure it out. When and how to fight back, right? You just have to reach out to Dov here, and he will gladly tell you when and how. So,
Exactly.
but I love that. That's like the positive note. Like it has been, I would admit, has been a difficult episode today because there's like a lot of bad news, and it feels like you're trapped. And you're trying to find, like my mind is just trying to find, like how do we protect against it? And we do our best, and even ourselves, in the profession that we have, what we do here, both George and I, like we try to protect your wealth. We try to protect as much as we can everything that you have built. We try to help you build a legacy that you can pass on to the next generation without a predatory clawback into your wealth. And that's basically the core of what we do here. In the age of AI, Dov, do you see, are they keeping up with AI? Are they using AI to trigger audits? Are they using big data? Tell us about it. Or they're pretty much very rudimentary for now?
I mean, they're definitely using AI. Again, they're not particularly transparent about exactly what they do or how they do things. They really don't like to discuss their audit methodologies, but we do know that they use AI. We know that they scour things. That's the thing to remember, right? Like the government has so many tools at its disposal and so many resources available to it that sooner or later they're going to find stuff. And it doesn't mean that it works well and doesn't mean that they're right, but they certainly have access to a lot of computing power. That's for sure.
They're not the brightest, but they have access to unlimited resources, and that
Pretty
compensates.
much. Pretty much. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that your message there, Dov, what you just summarized a few minutes ago is so important. I think that's really the crux of the matter, right? That's the whole purpose of this podcast episode is to let people know that you can fight back. There are resources available to help you fight back.
Indeed.
And we do not have to succumb to, what the government wants us to do for their benefit, not for ours, right?
Exactly.
Let's do things that benefit us and our families and our businesses.
Yep.
Stay within the rules, absolutely. But you don't have to be the compliant follower blindly doing whatever you're told to do. So that's part of our whole message is, as a sovereign capitalist, you want to work not necessarily in the system, because the systems are all created for someone else's benefit, not for your benefit. So let's work in a place that is going to benefit us. And that's what we help people do all the time. And we teach them. And it's so important to know that there is an option.
Absolutely.
Right? You don't always have to just bow down and comply when things are not fair, right? I really, really appreciate you sharing that message with us.
Of course, my pleasure.
How can people reach out to you if anyone is interested?
Well, you could certainly share my contact information, my email address, and my phone number. And people are more than welcome to contact me if they have questions, if they have issues, if there are disputes with the government. We have a whole team of people here whose job it is only to fight the government.
Yes, that's great. And we have also a whole team here of people that their only mission is to make sure that your wealth and everything you built for is protected. So you guys are our second layer, and we appreciate that.
Amazing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for listening, and I see you on the next episode.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dov.
Thank you.
This episode of the Sovereign Capitalist podcast was provided with the understanding that the staff and contributors of Asteris Capital Advisors are not herein engaged in rendering tax, legal, or financial advice. For such matters, please consult your own tax, legal, or financial advisor.